Hello, welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. I'm your host, Mike Baudendistel. I'm the head of intermodal solutions here at FreightWaves. So I've helped the data customers with their intermodal needs, and that is exactly the topic that we're going to dig into today. So today we're going to be talking about rail intermodal. We'll talk about the interaction between truckload and rail intermodal, sort of the competitive dynamics there, an area that we hear a lot of interest in from the shippers that we work with. Also, government officials want to move more over the railroads. The railroads themselves need to have that avenue for growth. So a lot of interested parties on this topic. And what we thought we'd do today is have on two guests, one from the Environmental Defense Fund, and then another who is a consultant who co-authored a report on that topic. The title of the report is "Decarbonizing Long Haul Freight," which is something that you can find. Just go to Environmental Defense Fund, and railroads should come right up. So we're going to speak with Andrew Howell, who's the head of research of sustainable finance at the Environmental Defense Fund, and then Bill Loftis, who does the management consulting, owner and principal of the company Supply Chain Ecology. Do we have Andrew and Bill? Just Andrew for now.
Howdy.
Good to see you.
You as well.
Thanks for.
Great to see you.
Yeah, so thanks for joining me on People Speaking Rail. Great topic. I read through the report that you had commissioned called "Decarbonizing Long Haul Freight." Really a lot to dig into, and I've actually sent a few of the slides to people here internally as kind of a intermodal 101 and certain things that make intermodal tick. But wanted to ask you, what drove your interest in that and caused you to commission this report?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for your interest in this work. Environmental Defense Fund, for those who don't know, is a large, as you can guess, environmental nonprofit based in the U.S. Been around for about 50 years, and focused on climate and on health. Really, the way that we work at EDF is trying to find practical ways to solve for the huge challenges we are facing on our planet, to transition to clean energy, to avoid the worst impact of the climate change that we're already seeing today. But we really do need to find practical solutions. The good news is there are a lot of practical solutions out there. And we're focused on working both with policy and with the private sector to try to make those happen. So we look at the big sources of climate polluting emissions out there, and how can we try to address those and transition those. And transportation, of course, is a huge piece of that. Within transportation, heavy-duty trucking is a big piece of the emissions sources. It's about 12%. So it's one of the biggest things you want to fix if you want to deal with the energy transition. And the really good news when it comes to medium and heavy-duty trucking is that there is a technology that exists, which is electrification, that is suitable for trucking. That's not the case for some other forms of transportation where those technologies still being figured out, like aviation, shipping, and trucking. We kind of know what we need to do, but we also know we're not fully there yet. We will take time to roll out those solutions. That's particularly the case for long-haul trucking, big distances. We need to still have better, more energy-dense batteries. We still need to build out the charging networks, aren't fully there. And so one of the areas that challenge in terms of we need to start to fix these things now, all the technologies and build out isn't fully ready. That led us to intermodal because, for long haul trucking, if you can move more freight to rail, you really can solve a lot of the source of emissions immediately, because the energy for rail is so much lower than it is for trucking. And so that's what led us to bring on Bill to help us look at really the what we think are quite significant opportunities in emphasizing this shift to intermodal.
That's great, and we do have Bill now, and Bill, why don't you take it from here a little bit, and what did you conclude by conducting this study? What were some of the big takeaways?
Oh, wow. Well, we covered a lot of ground here. In terms of big, most meaningful things we found, I'll go through a couple of them. One is just, and this wasn't unknown, but it was like help clarify a little bit. It's the scope of intermodal is pretty small when you look at the entire scope of truckload transportation. I mean, we knew all along that intermodal is focused on dense lanes. It's long trains, so it's high density, it's long moves. But I think you may have seen in the study, we drew out a little 4-box diagram where we looked at on one of the axes is length of haul, the other axis is density. Mm-hmm. And when you step back and look at that four square diagram, you realize that a large part of the truckload movements don't even qualify, if you will, for intermodal in the current ecosystem. So, mm-hmm. So that's, you realize that if you stick in this ecosystem that we know today, the chance for dramatic intermodal expansion is fairly small. So that kind of led us down a couple different solution paths. But so that was a big finding. It was more of a pop out, if you will. A big one we ran into was this new technology about autonomous electric bogies. That was a new one for me. If that technology is approved and it's cost competitive, then that could really impact the scope. And the reason is that the economics, they're more similar to trucking. So these platoons of 5, 10, 20 plus cars, that's dramatically different from the way intermodal trains move today, which can be 2 to 4 miles long. So where that takes us is that the rail's density calculus is changing if these things come to market and they're priced competitively. So if you go back to that scope diagram I just talked about, the scope changes. I'll say that 2 of our advisors were extremely familiar with this technology and both considered it to be, potentially game changing. So that looked to be a real promising thing we found. We learned a lot about carrier routings too, and how carrier routings are a limitation or a constraint. It's really a subset or a driver of the density question, but we had some findings that said these routings are kind of hard to come by. We had a situation during the course of the study where I've got a client in Eastern North Carolina. This is an example case study. They have the perfect intermodal freight. They ship low margin, full truckloads to retail DCs. There's not a better product for intermodal freight than something like that. And they do it when they can, but their closest intermodal terminal is 125 miles away. So they're very limited to very long moves. So they'll ship intermodal to Sacramento or LA, but they won't ship it to Chicago, which is still within reach. I mean, it's 800 miles away, but it doesn't qualify because the dray move is so long. Well, during the study, we discovered that a Class 1 carrier puts up an automated intermodal terminal 40 miles from their plant. So then it got into, well, wow, this is different. Your transportation has probably completely changed now, right? No, it hasn't. It turns out that terminal was over a year in existence. And still, when we were doing the study, the carrier was only implementing 3 destinations from that terminal out of its entire network. So it takes a long time for these perfect routings to develop and evolve. So, So what, the learning there is that, it's not just the system infrastructure. It's not just how many hubs are out there. It's the routings have to matter as well. So that was a learning. And we turned our attention a lot to short line rail in the course of the study. We learned about its role, its economics, how it integrates it sometimes with others. And that was pretty interesting. So, we've got 6 Class 1 carriers in the continent. There's over 600 Class 2 and Class 3 carriers. They own about 40% of the track in North America, but intermodal is only 1% of their volume. So this was kind of interesting. And all the data we found about short line economics, and we're going back to kind of the price competitive thing here, is that the short line economics are different from Class 1. They're generally less expensive. They're private companies. They're still businesses, so they need to make a profit, but I guess private companies look at profit differently than public companies do. So as we dug into those costs, what we discovered was that short line rail could potentially be much more cost competitive to truckload than the Class 1s are. And so we actually took a couple examples, and I think we confirmed that at much shorter moves, like 200 plus miles, the short line could potentially be competitive with truck. Now, in many cases, it matters on what the price of the truck is, obviously, but nonetheless, they're out there. So back to the scope diagram again, you now have a situation where shorter moves could potentially be intermodal qualifying as well. And so changes. So this got us thinking about the business model a little bit. Is there a way, what if we could create a business model where these short lines do more of the costly, complex activities like building train blocks for a destination, for example, and then connect them with a Class 1 that's running those long moves? Might that work? So that was something that came out of our study that we would draw to your attention. And we found out that the Class, they actually do integrate. There's not many, but they do integrate in intermodal. So what it stands to say is that this isn't just some far-fetched concept that's pie in the sky. This is actually happening. It's just a matter of putting it together. So so that was the final. The final thing I'll say, and most of my conversation up to now is around how we changed the scope. We probably didn't do enough attention towards the current ecosystem, that top right box. What we found there was really interesting was what shippers' priorities are and what tools they have to use. And what we found in that regard was, for the most part, the main factor for intermodal decisions is cost savings. So if we can save money, intermodal enters the conversation, has to be an acceptable service. So of the surveys, I think 95% of the shippers said cost was the big factor. 52% said capacity enhancement is a factor for including intermodal, but only 35% said emissions was a factor. So, so we found that from the priorities perspective, and that was kind of disappointing. As Andrew said, long haul trucking is a big contributor to, so to think that, you know, over 65% of the people we surveyed don't consider emissions as part of a transportation decision. That was disappointing. But here's an interesting thing in terms of what they're looking for in terms of service. It's really around reliability, much more so than times. And then we found, well, can you compare on reliability? And about half of them did not have the ability to compare performance of truck versus intermodal. So in the current ecosystem, that top right square we're talking about, that's a big deal. If we could somehow be more public about information to truly compare truckload versus intermodal, I think that would be a big accomplishment, because right now, without that information, a lot of shippers have to default and presume truck. So those are all a whole long, big findings.
Well, you bring up a lot of great points. And I'll ask kind of the question that stands out to me maybe the most is, short line railroads have not historically done much intermodal volume. Like, you look at Genesee and Wyoming's portfolio of companies that they own in North America, very little revenue from intermodal. You know, why is that? Why could it change? And you talk about building out these kind of micro hubs. would that be an investment from the class one in your vision, or from the short line, or assistance from the government, or how do you sort of see that?
Well, that's a great question. If the short line were to build it out, my gut is that they would see a place in their network where it could apply, right? So, and if they did, they would probably need to partner with municipalities who, there's federal money out there that will pay for a large part of these investments. So if they partnered with a municipality, then that would be two major stakeholders who could make that happen. So I think that's how it could happen. You're right. Intermodal is only about 1% of short lines volume. So they actually are out of the market for the most part. So it's kind of a new business channel for them. What would get them into it? There needs to be kind of the typical business thing. There needs to be recognition that this is out there. There needs to be a business case on, does it make sense to invest for a hub? Can you get federal monies to subsidize it? And if the answer is integrate with a class one, then they'd have to go through those integration conversations as well, and just make sure that everybody's on board. So those are just some thoughts.
Good thoughts. Andrew, wanted to ask you, have a chart here that from your report that I think is really good. So this is the efficiency advantage from electrification. And so, trucks and railroads run on diesel fuel. Those would be the blue bar charts. And, what's interesting is that, of course, rail has a fuel advantage on both, whether the industry was, both industries were diesel or both industries were electric. But even if rail were to stay diesel, that blue bar on the right, it still beats truck in orange. So I thought that was really interesting. And then, kind of where do you see, electrification going in these various vehicle types? I know it's more challenging with railroads. I think it's very challenging still with long haul. California does their own thing with CARB. How do you see this developing in the coming years for that long haul freight, which is primarily the focus here?
Yeah, well, thanks for pointing that out. And I think that it is an amazing chart when you think that even if rail does not itself electrify, which of course we also hope to see, but even if rail remains fully a diesel internal combustion engine technology, it would still produce fewer emissions than an electrified trucking system. Now that's using certain assumptions today on how those that where that electricity itself is generated, right? So we don't have a fully clean grid. Eventually, the grid becomes 100% driven by renewable energy. Then it would be lower emission. Essentially, would be zero emission. But today, diesel train is cleaner, and that's because it just is so much dramatically more efficient technology. But the reality is that trucking is electrifying, and we're seeing that happening today. EDF tracks both pilots by shippers, essentially, who are increasingly introducing electrification, electrified trucks into their supply chains, essentially, and fleets, which are starting to convert to electric trucks. We're seeing more availability of electric trucks every day. And on that, the announcements, we've seen a fourfold increase in sort of deployments compared with a year ago in the marketplace from a very low level. But what is electrifying, of course, are those applications which are easier to electrify. The reality is certain types of trucking operations lend themselves more easily to an electric technology. And that would be particularly shorter haul trips where you don't have too much mileage before you get a chance to charge, and return to base operations where you return to the same location every night and it have the opportunity to recharge overnight. That's a heck of a lot easier than what you're mentioning, which is those long haul trips where truck will go out for multiple days. You need to recharge on multiple times. It may not be a reliable, repeatable route either. So you need to have that charging network around as well as the downtime. That's a lot of variables that are not fully fully solved for today. So, what we expect to see, and this is what we're very much recommending all truck users to do strategically, is you focus on shifting to electrification where that works easiest first. So start with short haul, and we believe that most fleet operations can essentially electrify short haul trucking, within the next 5 years. But it's going to take longer, probably 10 to 15 years to fully electrify that long haul. And that's why other methods to bring down the energy usage efficiencies and this intermodal operation are really so important to be introducing now while you are working out the technology side.
Yeah, totally. I mean, electrification can only do so much here. Want to ask you about another table from your report, which is it shows this I find fascinating. So this is the market share of intermodal long haul, and as it stood last year, is that column on the left, 6%, which hopefully that's a low water mark. There was some market share loss from the previous few years, and you get it to really ambitious number of 22.4% by 2035. That is 11 years from now, but still ambitious nevertheless. And then you sort of break down how the industry can get there. And I guess within those things, which of those line items do you feel the most confident in that will come to fruition, and which ones are a little bit more of a stretch target?
Well, that's a great question. Boy, it's been a while since I've thought about this table. So I think the freight market benchmarking is achievable. I mean, we do that in different ways everywhere. It's just a matter of putting the shippers together and finding the right service provider to provide that visibility, or even for the class ones to do it. I think that is not rocket scientists. We do it in other venues, and why we can't do it right now with intermodal versus truck is almost a mind blower, in my opinion. We see that this is something that shippers need. I definitely think that could expand the market. So that's probably the more feasible. It's just a matter of putting it together. I think that the technology is there for the EV bogie. It's just a matter of, will it get approved and have it scale up? I mean, this isn't the pipe dream anymore. They're actually running pilots. So this ends up being more of an approval thing, and even for the autonomous piece of it. So I think that's probably going to happen. And I think the others are probably the idea of the conversion to short line. That's probably on the more of a reach. It requires a lot more just kind of business inertia and change. I mean, the reality that short lines don't even market to this sales channel right now is a big problem, right? I mean, how you go out and get these new customers that ship intermodal. So there's probably more barriers to break down on that integration, but one kind of can beget the other. I mean, if we suddenly create a world where the autonomous bogie comes and it proves viable in lower density lanes, then that means that more short line rails are going to be introducing themselves to another market. So some of these things actually beget each other. So that's just another comment.
Yeah, great thoughts there. And another one that's really interesting you didn't mention there was the Surface Transportation Board, which right now exempts intermodal from economic oversight. Sort of just assumes that there's a competitive dynamic there with the highway, and it's my view that that's true in some cases, but not in all cases. I think I think that in the eastern part of the country, there's always a truckload option from New York to Chicago, from Chicago to Atlanta. Like there's nothing anti-competitive there with the railroads that you really need economic oversight from the government. But I think from LA to Chicago, LA to Atlanta, I think that maybe those should not be exempt from STB oversight. So it's good that you touched on that. But it's, who knows, that's a tough one to call. It's hard to predict what's going to happen in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, we're out of time. Where can people reach out to you both? I'll start with you, Andrew.
Well, thanks, Mike. Yeah, you correctly noted our website. So EDF, and we are the part of EDF we are is EDF Business, where you can go to our website and find a whole bunch of research on different aspects of the energy transition and how the financial community can lean in to support these transitions from different sectors. These things are quite complicated. There's a lot of moving parts, and we try to unpack that and come up with some clear recommendations. So please, visit us at edf.org.
And Bill, how can folks reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm at billloftis.com and or email at bill@billloftis.com. It's probably the best way to reach me.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Hope everyone has a good day.